In 2007, two educators launched a conference designed to initiate discussion about creating a place for spirituality within the K-12 public education experience. These two educators, Meguido Zola, Associate Professor in Education from Simon Fraser University, and Kimberly Franklin, Dean of Education at Trinity Western University, join me today to discuss their views on spirituality in education, an issue that may seem controversial for some parents and others. What is a definition of spirituality that fits with our concept of public education? What are the merits and concerns with creating space for spirituality in public schools? I'm Paul Shaker, and this is an Education Matter. Welcome, Meguido and Kim. To lay the groundwork for our discussion, I think we need to talk about the definition of spirituality, particularly as it's distinct from religion, because we're talking about the public schools. So I understand, Meguido, you have an experience that you could share with us to help illustrate how spirituality can be looked at separately.
An example of a spiritual question. So when I was at the University of Bristol convocating, our chancellor was the philosopher Bertrand Russell, a preeminent philosopher in Europe. And he was well known to the general public because of his appearance, his great shock of white hair, and because he spent his time campaigning against nuclear disarmament, chaining himself to link fences, throwing little bombs and all kinds of, and marching and so on. And so he arrives on the morning at Bristol at Temple Mead Station, gets into a taxi, and the taxi driver, of course, recognizes him and looks in the mirror and he says, "Mr. Russell?" And, "Yes." "Mr. Russell, so what's it all about then?" And so there's that question. What is it all about? On the one hand, philosophy, universities, education, and so on. And on the other hand, anti-bombs, maybe we'll all die, and violence and so on. So this is a spiritual question. A spiritual question is about ultimate issues of concern, or issues of ultimate concern. It's about meaning making, and therefore it belongs to all of us, taxi drivers, philosophers, everybody, and it belongs all the time. We are constantly trying to make meaning.
Would you like to amplify that from your own point of view, Kim?
It's a great story. I would agree with Meguido that it is a meaning-making process and a way of knowing, but also it would be an awareness of the way you are in the world, an awareness of your way of being in the world, and a desire for, usually if people are interested in spirituality, it's a desire for a better way of being in the world, a more compassionate way, a more connected way, a more holistic way, a more loving way, and that includes a way of making meaning as well.
I think it has to do something also with something on the order of looking at things symbolically instead of materially. Would you say that there's something to that way of looking at spirituality? Symbolic interpretation of events, perhaps? Or
seeing the extraordinary in the ordinary, or the invisible grace in the visible, is another way of looking at it.
And perhaps another way to get at it is the price we pay if we don't deal with spirituality in the curriculum. Would you discuss some of the maladies that we experience in society, particularly through our youth, that may be as a result of not dealing adequately with spirituality through their developmental years?
Yes, so researchers like Robert Coles have shown that children are very spiritual beings. Constantly from a young age they're raising spiritual questions, and it behooves us to receive them in a particular way, which is to accept it, to create a safe and courageous space for expression and so on. And if we don't, and if we censor those kinds of questions, as we tend to do in most school curricula, we really stamp on their spirit, and they can't make meaning together with us. It is done inside. And education is about making meaning with others.
Kim, do you see any particular costs that we pay for not dealing with spirituality in the curriculum?
I think one of the things that happens is you end up having a default way of being that's imposed on our students, as Meguido was saying, where they view the world as very fragmented and disconnected. They don't see themselves in their own learning and in their own education process. They can't find a place for themselves. They don't learn how to create a space for themselves. They end up having the imposition of a very fragmented, consumeristic, materialistic worldview imposed on them.
And I'd add, they're not the subjects of their own lives. They become the objects of others' lives, parents' lives, teachers' lives. And what they want in life is to become the subject of their lives. So it's all about growth.
A great deal of what we hear talked about as the aims of education have to do with economics in the newspaper or from our political leaders. And I think you're saying that that's not an adequate viewpoint for the schools to have in dealing with our youth.
I'm saying that it is definitely not an adequate viewpoint. I would like something more hopeful, more inspiring. When I'm a parent and when I send my son to school, I want to know what inspires him. When I look at his report card, I'm looking at the comments that the teachers make about the way he is in school, the way that he interacts with other people, the way that he is developing as a person. So I'm much more interested in that than the economic value of his education.
Now, I can hear some critics of this line of reasoning saying that this is too soft, that this is too touchy-feely. But in my experience, this really subsumes the economic. If you're dealing with this aspect of people's motivation, they will certainly become productive economic members of society and good citizens. Isn't that your experience?
Yeah, I remember I loved going to school. I've had nothing but good schools. But the best times in schools were when the teacher we took the teacher off on a tangent and he told war stories or he told family stories and stuff. Because then we got really connected, intimate to the heartbeat of life. And we could sense, what is this life about? And the curriculum is fine, it's part of it, and you can certainly infuse it with spirituality, but there's also a time to talk about the more general issues of ultimate concern.
I think we aim too low when we make the purpose of schools economic, because if we aim higher and make the purpose of schools self-realized individuals with a rich spiritual life, they'll not only do the economic, but they'll do more.
Yeah.
Because part of spirituality is inner wellness and the ability to bring healing and outer wellness to the people that you interact with. So if you're focused on building rather than destructing, then you're automatically going to fulfill that economic purpose.
Well, I had introduced this line of discussion talking about the price we pay, and I think that price has to do with things like substance abuse, gang violence, and other of the maladies of youth. This energy of youth to find meaning, if it isn't given direction in the home or by the school or by both, then I think these are some of the pathways it takes. Now, this leads us to then, how do we bring spirituality into the curriculum of the schools? And I know, Kim, you've published on this subject, and Meguido has also worked with teachers in this regard. I think people are interested then in the specifics of, if we grant that there's a need for this kind of curriculum, what form would it take so that it remains appropriate for all students in the public schools and honors the equality that we grant all our citizens in their personal beliefs and values? Could you tell us some of the aspects of how spirituality is introduced into the curriculum?
Well, I think spirituality is already present in the curriculum, and it's there both explicitly and implicitly already. So what I would like to focus on is bringing more attention to spirituality in the curriculum, because it's already there. It's there in our students because they're spiritual beings. The teachers are spiritual beings. None of us check our spirituality at the door. So we already have it present, but it's also there in the content of the curriculum. When we talk about Aboriginal spirituality, for example, which is a required curriculum outcome in British Columbia, it's very explicitly present. When we introduce works of great literature and art to our students, the motivations and the values that are implicit in those works of art bring spirituality into the classroom. So when we involve our students in becoming part of the learning process and engaging them in acts of inquiry, allowing them to ask the big questions and the real questions that Meguido was talking about. Spirituality is already there, so it's a matter of paying attention to it. And when we don't pay attention to it, what happens is the spirituality goes underground. And I think that's more dangerous than bringing it out into the open and talking about it, because bias is always going to be present. And when we try to deal with that bias by pushing it underground and not discussing it, that bias becomes even more dangerous. And so you have room for hidden agendas, or you have room for private practice. And we really want to bring it out into the open so that we can talk about how we can do this in ways that are respectful and are welcoming all voices. Right.
A couple of ideas come to mind as Kim speaks of this, Meguido. One is the notion of authenticity. I think I hear her saying when we try not to deal with spirituality, we run the danger of seeming inauthentic to young people.
Yes.
And the other is aesthetics. So these
authenticity, I think of the classroom, because that's what we're really talking about. The classroom is a place where, in an organic, natural way, issues of importance like death, jealousy, whatever, caring, neglect, etc., are raised through literature and through social studies and so on. If, as teachers, we're not willing to receive those questions and indeed maybe surface them, raise them, then we're being less than authentic. And teachers, schools, we're in loco parentis, and I know that these issues are raised at home, so why wouldn't they be raised in the classroom? And there's a tendency for the system to sort of contain this and censor it and bracket it aside. And I would like to see schools be much more supportive of parents and homes by allowing those questions to be raised. We're very good at doing that, by the way, when it comes to saving the earth, you know, since Rachel Carson and so on. So we have children talking about, you know, what is it, processing stuff and looking after the earth, and we also empower children to do various things in their communities.
Another couple words that come to mind as you speak are joy and inspiration. And those are dimensions of spirituality, I think, that students are hungry to see demonstrated. And if they are not demonstrated in the school, then I think the attention of the young person may stray away from the general experience of school.
Yeah, so if school were a little more holistic, it wasn't just about the classroom, the curriculum, but about other things like sports and hobbies and activities, there will be more opportunity for us all to celebrate our differences.
Students are really looking more than anything else for a pathway to grow into adulthood. And if they don't see one that leads to a satisfying and inspired adulthood, then I think their attentions are going to turn elsewhere.
And that's why the curriculum is so important in terms of bringing in examples of people who have found their way to adulthood and have found a way that is very impactful on the world around them. So I'm thinking of Martin Luther King and Mother Teresa and Gandhi, and some textbooks will characterize them as civil rights activists and social workers and politicians, rather than understanding the spiritual path that they've chosen that's helped them become the kind of people that they became. So I think it's really important for us to identify for our students the spiritual roots of things and not just superficially introduce content and history and literature in a way that doesn't allow them to see that these things were instrumental in the people's lives and the choices that they made.
Spirituality and education is our discussion today. We'll be back in a moment.
For more than 40 years, the Faculty of Education at SFU has been delivering academic programs that are innovative and responsive. Based on the academic research of our professors and the expertise of practicing teachers from your communities, our programs are designed to meet classroom needs. As a community, we're piecing together a successful education experience for students today and in the future.
Our guests on the program today are Kimberly Franklin and Meguido Zola. Karen Armstrong, the noted author about spirituality, says the key to it is compassion. And I wondered if you could reflect with me a little bit on why compassion would be at the heart of spirituality and why that would be a powerful element to bring more into the day-to-day life in our schools.
Well, I suppose compassion is love, and I suppose all spiritualities throughout the ages have pointed to that as the underlying heart beat of whoever we are. So it's about other-centeredness, other-directedness, acceptance of others, and so on. And I think that's the one value that we need more and more of in our world, lest it otherwise just implode or explode.
Now, Armstrong goes on to make a psychological point out of this. She says that it leads us to lifespan developmental psychology goals that all human beings have, that when we get out of ourselves and look at things from the point of view of the other, we help to reduce the focus on the ego that we're prone to. Mm-hmm. Now, lifespan developmental psychology is not much a part of the curriculum of a liberal education or teacher education. I wonder if we really can succeed at this goal of spirituality and education in the public schools if we don't do more with lifespan developmental psychology.
Are you talking about the teacher education program?
Yes, that would be
in particular?
Certainly
Okay.
one place we'd like to see it.
I know that it is present in most teacher education programs in terms of a course, but I think there's something very different from a course in the actual experience of a student who is, or a student teacher, beginning teacher, who is trying to themselves become spiritually developed and understand the different ways that their ways of being have impact on students and their learning. And so I think we need to do more than just give them a course in lifespan development. I think we need to really help students have an opportunity to talk about the tensions that they find in the way that they are experiencing their education and the way that they are hoping that their future students will experience their education, and the way that they are trying to become more compassionate and to see how that fits within a system that really is often in contradiction to being very compassionate, one that's much more competitive. Mm-hmm. And one that requires teachers to cover curriculum and to measure everything. You know, Einstein said that everything that everything that can be measured doesn't necessarily count, right? And so, so I think in an education system that is requiring more and more measurement of learning, I think teachers often have beginning teachers often have a very difficult time of resolving their desire to create a more inviting and hopeful and inspiring and compassionate space for their students, but also to have this requirement of having a mark at the end of their growth that brings them back into the competitive economic model. So
this takes us back, I think, some to authenticity, Meguido, and it's a different kind of learning. I think that's what Kim is pointing to. This has to go beyond repetition of rote memorized principles or something, and maybe it's a high barrier to overcome in our curriculum of higher education. Do you think we can succeed at this in teacher education?
Yes, we can succeed. I was working with some student teachers who are teachers in other countries and are certificating here. And right after the first incident that happened, I asked them if it was a good thing to guess and whether they would encourage children to guess. And that was very controversial because they thought, no, there were right and wrong answers. And I said, well, most of my curriculum, there aren't any. There's not right or wrong, there's just right or left. And so we were talking about literature and how literature isn't anymore about what did the author intend by saying X, Y, and Z, and what was in his mind, and no, you're wrong, I know what the author really intended, but much more, how do you respond to what the writer said? And that happens in kindergarten or grade 12 with literature, where we're constantly using it. and inviting children into that space to explore and to become themselves through the dialogue.
Well, it's quite a challenge we're taking on here. I mean, it is the principal challenge of human society,
Yes.
to elevate people in what we traditionally call the liberal education way, to have this view on themselves from outside themselves, that ecstatic view, and to be able to become more than simply the ego, the choice-making, decision-making aspect. So that's a major barrier to dealing with spirituality and education. There's a resistance, as Erik Erikson tells us in his psychology, to passing through these stages of life. On the other hand, there are other barriers that are more day-to-day. I know, Kim, you're very sensitive to these barriers. Could you explore a few of those with us?
Well, I think one of the barriers is a fear of bias. You know, that maybe if we bring spirituality into the curriculum, how can we be sure that all spiritual paths are articulated well for students, and you know, fears that individual teachers will bring their biases into the classroom, or individual schools will bring their biases into their classroom. And so I think that's one barrier that would be very present. But when we realize that the bias is already present, and you know, like I said before, if we don't bring it out into conversation, we are never going to be able to do a better job at making sure that that bias is more balanced.
Yes, you said earlier in the program that we revert to a default if we don't consciously deal with this, and we pay a high price for reverting to that default. And the default comprises some pretty low-level values, really. Just selfish ones, materialistic ones, competitive ones, sometimes even violent ones. And I think that perhaps isn't obvious to people who would resist bringing spirituality into the curriculum of public schools. You can't escape it, I think was your point. And at the cost of being accused of bias, we otherwise will slip into default. Meguido, you're a specialist in narrative and literature. And is there a particular reason why narrative would enliven the spirituality aspect of the curriculum?
Because it's amenable to open-ended treatment of it. And there are no right or wrong answers. There are only perhaps more researched answers, more well-defended responses, etc. There's also the narrative of the world around us. I mean, one of the things I have learned to trust in life is that crises and or change creates conditions for us such that we need to be more spiritual about the narrative that's happening around us. So, for instance, war in other countries, it forces us to confront these questions. Should we be in Afghanistan, in Iraq, etc.? The imploding financial situation right now will definitely engender possibilities for teachers and children to be talking about that narrative, to be making some kind of meaning about it. And one of the big changes that's happened in our Canadian society is the large migration of other groups of people. And that's a great welcome change, because here are people who have a very different kind of history in regards to spirituality. Here are people who, I would say, all over the world, in comparison to North America, spirituality is very strong and alive in people. It is just like the root word, it is spirit. It is their most aliveness. And that is what students of other cultures tell me they're not able to bring into the classroom. And but here's an opportunity for us to open up discussion.
I'd like to return to the costs of not dealing with this. As I think about the problems that parents face with their children, concerns about their health, of avoiding substance abuse and smoking, for example, of staying away from depression, teen suicide, or gang membership, all of these things seem to me are rooted in spiritual questions and questions of value. And so as I contemplate our discussion today, I'm really called to reflect upon how many of these major problems we face with our youth are really keyed to spirituality and education. I want to thank you both for being with us. today,
Thank you.
and I hope that your quest to insert spirituality, to infuse it into the curriculum, is successful in BC and elsewhere.
Thank
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
We'll be back in a moment. Our Western societies have been slow to establish a way of discussing spirituality that is separate from religious faith. Without such language, however, we cannot provide a comprehensive educational experience in our public schools. This is due in part because at the heart of learning is motivation, and much of motivation stems from our non-material psychological needs. Since public schools must serve youth of all religious backgrounds and of no religious background, they must have a way of discussing in a universal manner issues of meaning, development, morality, and inspiration. The arts help us in this quest, as well as the work of philosophers and psychologists such as Carl Jung. Proceeding with care, educators can and must address our students' spirituality if we are to serve the whole person in our multicultural society. Thank you for watching Your Education Matters.
For more information about this show or to view past episodes, go to the Your Education Matters website at www.youreducationmatters.ca. The views and opinions presented in this program are not necessarily those of all faculties, staff, or administration at SFU.